Good afternoon. Today is the 11th lecture. Let us begin as usual with the questions. Question. I apologize in advance if we are talking about non-existent dragons, in quotes. How close to the truth in your understanding are the following objective laws? The exclusion from consciousness of the space of acceptable variance, for which we are striving, manifests itself in sensations, such as melancholy, sadness, regret, and so on. Yes, it is possible. Continuation. And vice versa. Joy is the inclusion in the space of acceptable variance of those scenarios that satisfy the tree or branch of objectives. Yes, this is also possible. Because if we consider emotions from the position of the informational algorithmic conception of the psyche of a person, then emotions are simply very densely packed information that goes to the level of consciousness from the unconscious levels of the psyche, and which needs to be unpacked and meaningfully comprehended in concrete terms. Therefore, there can be bad emotions in the form of melancholy, sadness, regret, and the like, in the event that some admissible but attractive variants for the development of events, for some reason, are excluded from this set of relevant possibilities. Continuation. Is there any point in further pondering about the types of emotional experiences, about whether any joy is good, or further conclusions are unacceptable? It makes sense to talk about the type of emotional experiences only in the concretics of these very experiences. Because the same emotions in different people, by strength of the difference in their nraviousness and world understanding, can be caused by completely different flows of events. Therefore, everything is concrete. In the concretics of life circumstances, and in the concretics of the reaction of a particular person to these life circumstances. As for the reaction, then in the informational algorithmic theory of personality, the reaction is conditioned by real nraviousness, but not by the declared nraviousness, and not by that mood. That is, the emotion-meaning structure in which a personality acts in these or those circumstances. Question. Good day. How does the collective of authors relate to the work of G.S. Altshuler, to his works Theory of Solution of Inventive Tasks and Life Strategy of a Creative Personality? Is the theory of solution of inventive tasks suitable for the solution of particular concrete tasks? We are familiar with the works of G.S. Altshuler for the solution of some aggregate of some plurality of tasks. The methodics proposed by him is suitable, but by strength of the fact that every creative act is ultimately unique, moreover unique in two ways, it is required to solve a task that no one has ever posed, and moreover, a personality who solves the task also has some peculiarity. Then, an attempt to algorithmize the creative principle, its implementation, is simply a dead end in relation to a number of tasks. Therefore, some tasks can really be solved according to the methodics of G.S. Altshuler, and some tasks, according to these methodics, in principle, cannot be solved, because dialectics does not know the limitations by whichever formalization and algorithmization of the type do this, you get that result, do not do that, you will not get that result. Creativity is free from any algorithmization, although it is always really a certain sequence of actions leading to a certain result, but the algorithm of creativity in this understanding is always unique. and after the task is solved, in many cases, it stops being relevant for the future. Although, of course, it goes into the reserve of the life experience of a person.
В запас жизненного опыта человека.
Question. In one of his last lectures, I don't remember exactly which one, V.M. Zaznobin said that the whole ideology serves as a cover for an unprevious conception. The questioner used the word krayny, which means extreme. The norms of the Russian language oblige the adjective extreme to be used in relation to spatial and geographical localization. In relation to chronological localization, other words are required. Last. Moreover, I want to emphasize that the word last is not necessarily the last in the sense of final, completing, but last in the sense of chronology. Therefore, this kind of superstition, which is expressed in inappropriate use of words of the Russian language in the wrong context for which they are intended, should in fact be avoided. Although it is not excluded that the very falling under the power of this kind of superstition is conditioned by the fact that there is a certain disorder in the psyche of the individual, and it works in the mode of interaction with egregors when it can cause trouble from nothing. This is the source of such not very, to put it mildly, correct use of many words of the Russian language. Now, with regard to ideology. Well, let's take a classic example. The Bible. Who remembers what? Everyone usually remembers the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and so on. What else is there? There is also something like this. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Unto a stranger, that is not a Jew, thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to, in the land whither thou goest to possess it. By and large, if you go into the essence, politically correctly speaking, of the institution of credit with loan interest, and not politically correctly speaking, then usury is a violation of the commandment, thou shalt not steal. With the help of financial technology, which is not considered, is not recognized by many people as stealing. And this is one of the examples of how, to put it mildly, the unfavorable conception is covered by a certain ideological system. That is, if the conception is wrong, unprevious, and directed against people, then if you reveal all of its defaults, then society will not accept this conception. It will reject it. And the only question is the length of time it will take society to reject this conception. Therefore, this kind of conception is carried out in life under some kind of ideological cover. The task of this ideological cover is to make the conception attractive to the broad masses by hiding the content of this
содержание
conception,
этой
which for
концепции,
these broad
которая
masses
для этих
will really
широких
be
народных
unacceptable.
масс реально будет неприемлемым. По сути, под
In essence,
разговоры
while
о
talking
10
about 10
заповедей,
commandments,
не
thou
убей,
shalt
не
not kill, thou
укради
shalt not
и
steal,
так далее и
thou
тому
shalt not lie,
подобное,
and so on,
проводится в
the
жизнь
conception of
концепция
enslaving humanity in the
порабощения
name of God,
человечества от имени
circumventing
Бога
God,
помимо Бога.
is being carried out.
И такого рода
And this kind of
политический
political
проект, он
project
действительно
really
требует
requires a corresponding ideological support. And we
соответствующего
must pay tribute.
идеологического
This
обеспечения.
ideological support is
Надо
working
отдать
effectively.
должное, это идеологическое обеспечение.
Here is an example of the impact of this ideological support on a person enslaved by the Bible. The result of the Bible's impact on zombies.
Человека, порабощенного Библией. Результат
Fragment from a letter of Pavel Florensky to Vasily Rozanov,
Павла Флоренского,
dated October the
Василия
26th,
Розанова,
1913.
26 октября 1913 года.
Do we believe the Bible or not?
Верим ли мы апостолу
Do we believe
Павлу?
the Apostle Paul or not?
Мы только
We
так,
believe
между
insofar
прочим.
as
Израиль
Israel
же
is the
стержень
core of world
мировой
history.
истории. Такова
This is the
высшая
highest
воля.
will.
Если
If we
смиримся,
humble
в
ourselves,
душе
the joy of the
радость
last
последней
obedience
покорности.
is in our souls.
Если будем
If we
упорствовать,
persist, we will
отвергнемся
reject the
того
very
самого
Christianity
христианства,
for which we
ради
argued
которого
with Israel.
спорили с Израилем.
That
То
is,
есть
again, we
опять
will fall under the heel of Israel. The promise of God is immutable. We must ourselves complete our circle of submission to Israel. And truly, however you look at things, only one thing is seen. The Old Testament makes and relentlessly reiterates the problem of future domination over the world. To whom? To the Jews. And the New Testament, it by no means tells us Christians that this dominion is now passing to us Christians, but only calls us to patiently carry our cross, and promises salvation for this. One canon contradicts the other, but not because both say one thing, but precisely because both say different things, and different things are addressed to different persons. And this deep and fundamental divergence of both canons, reconciled with the high soaring of spiritual contemplation, as was the case with the Apostle Paul, intolerably cuts and burns our wingless and flabby consciousness. This is the answer, provided that we believe the Bible and the Apostle Paul. Well, if we do not believe the Bible and the Apostle Paul, then it turns out that there should be no intermediaries between man and God. Every person communicates with God in a straightforward way, according to Sovest, and must live in accordance with it. If we talk about intrasocial relations, then no one should be the master of the other, although, of course, the functions of leaders and the functions of subordinates are different, but their difference does not affect the essence of the souls of each of them, but is connected with the performance of certain functions in the life of society, in the social association of labor. Outside the fulfillment of these functions, the relationship should be comradely. Usury, as a method of robbing, financially subordinating other people and peoples as a whole, must be eliminated and completely excluded from the practice of social life. Well, if so, according to Sovest and sane reasoning, then what I said fully corresponds to the norms of the Quranic revelation. This leads to the next question. Do we believe the Quran and the one who sent it down? Because if we put both texts of the Bible and the Quran on the table, then neither of them is better than the other, and there is no halo of holiness around either one or the other. That is, we go into the room, the light is off in the room, there is a Bible on the table, and it shines in all directions, and we can use it instead of a light bulb. That is, the two texts as messengers, one is not better than the other. But if you read them and correlate them with life, then further there arises the question of preferences. Do we believe the Bible? Do we believe the Quran? Do we believe life as such, our senses, our intellectual power given to us by God? And how do we correlate what is written in both books with this intellectual power and our senses? Now, if we believe the Bible, then we don't need intellect, because what is written in the Bible does not lead to the improvement of the world. Although the entire ideological system of biblical culture is oriented towards the fact that the Bible is all the light in the window, all the light of the world, and so on. Further, question that any ideology serves as a cover for an unprevious conception. How in this case should the third priority of generalized means of governance, weaponry, operate within society, if it is not supposed to exist in an anti-crowd elite society? You see, ideology and scientific theories, these are different things. The third priority of generalized means of governance also includes scientific theories that explain life. Scientific theories differ from ideology in that a scientific theory must be metrologically consistent. And ideology is not required to be metrologically consistent. It must be emotionally attractive. It should correspond to some prejudices of people which have already formed. And the question is, who and how formed these prejudices? Moreover, you see, the situation is such that natural scientific theories, they took shape historically in such a way that they correspond to the principles of metrological consistency. Because practice is the criterion of truth, and if a theory is somewhere, somehow false or unreliable, then many practical tasks on its basis are either not solved at all or solved within some limited boundaries. But the humanities and social science disciplines, unfortunately, in today's culture, are largely metrologically inconsistent. They are just words on perisocial themes. They do not give an idea of how society generates certain problems. They do not give an idea of how these problems should be solved and can be solved. They do not give an idea of those objective laws that condition the life of our society, humanity as a whole, and every one of us. Moreover, I especially want to emphasize that we are not talking about some kind of dogmatic formulations that should be legalized, spelled out in all textbooks, and so on and so forth. Because the objective laws as such, this is not words. This is a certain co-measurement of causes and effects in life. And this co-measurement can be described in different words, in different languages. Depending on the circumstances, this co-measurement of causes and effects in some cases can be described better in some formulations, in other cases it can be better described in other formulations. Therefore, the question is not about the formulations. The question is about the fact that scientific theories of the social and humanitarian direction have to show people the way to the comprehension of these objective laws, that is, to the formation of imaginative views, life-consistent, imaginative understandings of how these objective laws work in life. And if the conception is correct, pravyas, it does not need an ideological shell as an instrument for concealing it, concealing its essence. It can really express itself in social science, in humanitarian knowledge, which can be presented to interested people with varying degrees of detailedness, from literally a few phrases to thick monographs intended for professionals.
Буквально нескольких фраз до толстых монографий, предназначенных для специалистов-профессионалов.
Further, question. So the Constitution of the Russian Federation, by its ban on ideology, currently protects against another illusion brought down from the top. You see, this phrase is not accurate, because the Constitution proclaims a ban on state ideology. And the Constitution proclaims ideological pluralism in society. That is, many ideologies can be present in society. So the state ideology and the plurality of ideologies in society as a set of opinions that are inherent in any one person or some social group on some questions. This is ideology in the given case. Ideology in society and state ideology, these are different phenomena in life, because the state power, this is an instrument for governing the affairs of social life on a professional basis. In order for the state power to work, coordination of actions is required at all levels of what is now commonly called the vertical of power. This means that if the head of state, parliament, proclaims certain objectives of social development, proclaims the ways and means of achieving these objectives, then, in this way, what the Constitution calls the state ideology takes shape. Further, state power should proceed on the basis of this very state ideology. That is, if one of the officials sabotages the politics in accordance with the proclaimed objectives and ways and means of achieving them, then, in the soft version, it should be pointed out to him that he, to put it mildly, is not dobrosovichtis, but in the hard version he must be held responsible according to Article 275 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, high treason. But if the state ideology is prohibited at the level of the Constitution, and the head of state, the law enforcement system, begins to demand that officials of state power, in bodies of state power, observe certain norms, certain actions that correspond to the declared objectives of state politics, then any such saboteur can start yelling on the theme that the Constitution requires the absence of state ideology, and the persecution in relation to him is of an unconstitutional character.
Вот. Это
This is the real
реальное
situation of affairs connected
положение
with our
дел,
current
связанное с нашей
constitution.
Конституцией, ныне действующей. Но в
But in the
Конституции есть еще
constitution there are still
пара
many governarily
управленчески
inconsistent
несостоятельных
provisions,
положений, которые, в
which are the
общем-то,
result of the
являются
fact
результатом
that it was
того, что
written,
его
well, to put it mildly,
написали,
by not very
мягко
smart
говоря,
and not very
нищеброды или
competent
не сильно
people
компетентные люди под
under the
диктовку
dictation of
зарубежных
foreign
правил,
curators who were
которые
perfectly aware
прекрасно
of what they
отдавали
wanted and
себе
want
отчет в том,
from
чего
state
они
governance
хотят
in
от
Russia.
государственного управления в России. Поэтому
Therefore, the
Конституция
constitution is
написана
written
так,
in
что
such a way
государственная
that the state ideology,
идеология,
which is necessary for the
которая
uniformity
необходима
of
для
governance
разнообразия
at all
управления
levels of
на
state
всех
power,
уровнях
is
государственной
prohibited,
власти запрещена, а
and the
Центробанк
central bank is
юридически ни за
juridically
что
not
не
responsible
отвечает
for
перед
anything
Российской
to the Russian
Федерацией.
Federation.
Ну и в Конституции есть
Well,
еще
in the
несколько
constitution
других
there is still a multitude of other
вопросов,
questions
которые не
that do not allow
позволяют
Russia to
России
live the
жить
way
так,
a free
как
democratic country should
должна
live.
жить свободная демократическая страна. Подскажите,
Question.
как помогать деткам
Can you please
освоить
tell me
искусство
how to help
диалектики?
children master the art of
Интуитивно понятно,
dialectics?
что нужно
It is
размышлять
intuitively
над
clear that I
созданием
need to ponder
различных
with them on
форм,
various themes,
развивать воображение,
develop
широты
imagination and breadth of
фантазии. Что
outlook.
главное в этом
What is
процессе?
the main thing in this process?
Главное в этом процессе
The main thing in this process
искренность,
is sincerity,
фальшь.
because children sense falsehood.
Без фальши, искренне,
And if you,
растете
without
повторно,
falsehood, sincerely grow,
вместе с ними,
repeatedly
вместе с
together
ними
with them,
познаете мир, то тогда
and
результат
together
будет
with them
то,
cognize
что
the
вы
world,
осваиваете
then the
диалектику
result will
как
be
искусство
that you master
познания,
dialectics as
так
the
и
art of
дети
cognition,
втягиваются в процесс
and the
и тоже
children are also drawn into the process and also master dialectics as the art of cognition.
В четвертом
Question.
томе основ социологии
Volume 4 of
сказано, что
Fundamentals of
глобального
Sociology says
предиктора
that for the global
краха
predictor,
глобальной
the collapse of the current global
цивилизации
civilization of humanity
более
is not a tragedy,
воплощенных, имеющих
especially for those who are not
тела,
incarnated,
не
having
имеющих
only field
тела.
bodies,
Я
but not
правильно
having
понимаю,
material
что это
bodies.
значит? Они
Do I
выживут в
understand
любом
correctly what
случае.
this means?
У них такие
Will they survive
возможности
anyway?
есть. И будут
They have such
способны
possibilities
строить
that they will
новую
definitely build a new civilization they need, still having knowledge.
Если мы допустим крах нынешней
Yes, if we
цивилизации,
allow the collapse of the current civilization, then they will survive and will do what they did
чем
before.
занимались и раньше.
Continuation.
Как было
As it
после
was
гибели
after the death of
Атлантиды и
Atlantis
других
and other
цивилизаций,
civilizations before us,
но может уровень
well,
комфорта
maybe the level of comfort will be less,
придется начинать
but again, you have to start all over again.
человеческий
The fact that they don't care a fig about the whole human race is clear. That is, the main idea in this phrase is that the global predictor has the ability to survive in any catastrophe. So for them, this is not a tragedy or a different meaning. No, this is precisely that meaning, that the global predictor, those who are incarnated, in fact have certain limitations, because to die in a catastrophe is, after all, unpleasant. But if civilization rolls back to a more primitive level of development of the technosphere, culture, for them this is not a problem. But as for the non-incarnated ones, well, those really, as long as the planet exists, do not care a fig about everything else. Well, if the planet repeats the fate of Phaeton, then perhaps they will also have some troubles. But if civilization rolls back even to the Stone Age, anywhere, this is not a problem for them. Question. Recently, one can often hear the opinion that people who lie are superior to those who tell the truth. In particular, there is such a saying, lies are not limited by anything, but the truth is limited by the truth. There is no doubt that living in truth is acceptable for the Almighty, but most people who hope for the truth really find themselves in the position of a loser, since they do not know how to reveal a lie. Does this mean that the main instrument of the fight against lies is intuition and prompts from the Creator in the form of circumstances. Well, in fact, if society lives in lies, then it lives as it lives. As for revealing a lie, well, revealing a lie based on your own knowledge, your own system of senses, your own intellect, has certain limits, but nonetheless, it is also possible. But everything related to revealing lies in the absolute, this is really a life according to your Sovist, in a dialogue with the Almighty. He will prompt, find ways to indicate what truth is, what lie is, and then you can see them in the concretics of manifestations. And you can see who is simply a prisoner of lies, a slave, and who lies knowingly, being aware of the fact that he is lying. Question. Good day. How can one understand the purpose of the tree of knowledge in the Old Testament? If we talk about the ancient world, then in the ancient world there was no such concept as an algorithm, a sequence of actions leading to a certain objective. But life, history, it is algorithmic, regardless of whether there is the word algorithm or there is no word algorithm. And when there is no scientific, conceptually determined terminology, where everything is precisely determined as metrologically consistent concepts that can be univocally connected with life in the concretics of the events of life, when there is no such thing, a lot of knowledge can exist in a metaphorical, allegorical form. Pay attention to the fact that there is in culture a metaphor of the tree of knowledge. And the tree of knowledge is not a fir tree or a palm tree, but usually an apple tree. Why? Because a fir tree or a palm tree are, first of all, a straight trunk. And knowledge is not always straight. That is, results are achievable on paths with many twists, turns, and other things. In addition, the fruits of the fir tree and the fruits of many types of palms, they are of no interest to people, since they are not a food product. But the fruits of an apple tree, they are indeed fruits, and an apple is a very healthy product. And the phrase from one medical dream, actually, all apples are rejuvenating, but you are so sinful. That is, the apple tree as a metaphor for the tree of knowledge, the algorithmics of cognition, is actually life consistent. Further, what's what in this metaphor? The soil, this is objectively given life and texts inherited from past eras. The root system is the methodology of cognition. Hence the saying, the tree is strong by its roots. also correlates with this metaphor. From the root system goes the trunk, the sufficiently general theory of governance. The top of the trunk is a crown. The crown is applied scientific disciplines. The boundary of every branch and trunk is metrology, that is, a science or teaching on how to correlate the conceptual apparatus of a concrete scientific discipline with life. Well, the fact that all applied sciences are the basis of governance towards some process is in one way or the other understandable. And if you possess the methodology, then nothing prevents you from going the path from the soil to the fruits in the crown on your own. But you can go along this path in different ways. That is, cognition can proceed on the basis of a dialogue with God, then it's safe. And cognition can proceed on the basis of the unrestrained self-concoction of the cognizing subject. And then it's inevitably accompanied by various kinds of concomitant effects, which in some cases can completely devalue the achieved result. I will not show any pictures now, but there is a recording of my lecture on YouTube dedicated to sovereignty. The metaphor, the tree of knowledge, is commented on there. In reality, the danger is a cognitive self-concoction, which does not know any obvious ethical restrictions. The work of a cognizing subject, under the power of the dictatorship of Sovest, is safe for others, and moreover, is a prerequisite for creatively solving the problems that humanity has inherited from the past. Next question. And people who leave earthly life, where do they go from the position of the conception of social safety and the sufficiently general theory of governance? Well, to the person who asked this question, netizens themselves give answers that presumably, from the position of the triunity, the body goes to the ground, the information accumulated during life goes to an egregor, and the soul goes to God. Yes, this is indeed the case in our understanding. The body, both material and biofield ones, are parts of creation. Creation disposes of them in some way. Information and algorithmics accumulated during life remain in the noosphere. In the ancient Slavic tradition, this is nav, and the soul goes to God. Next question. And revenge, is it justice? No, revenge is not justice. Revenge is a useless waste of time and energy that you could spend on your own personal development, or helping in the development of the one against whom you want to take revenge. Revenge is self-satisfaction. That is, a type of masturbation. And previous justice differs from revenge in that it gives a possibility or stimulates the one in relation to whom you would like to exert a reciprocal impact on his unprevious, from your point of view, actions. Previousness stimulates him to develop. And in the Quran, in connection with this, it is said, that patience is very important. If a person is patient, dobrous, and active, then the former enemy inevitably becomes his friend. This is how praviousness is different from revenge. Revenge is fruitless, destructive in relation to both the object of revenge, often in relation to others who, in fact, had nothing to do with the events that entailed revenge. So, revenge is always within the boundaries of God's allowance. This is where the questions are over, and let's move on to the next theme. Section 13.5. Internal conflicts of governance in a supersystem. A supersystem is a plurality of elements. In one supersystem, nested supersystems can also take shape. And since both elements and supersystems self-govern in some way, this means that they have some vectors of objectives. Vectors of objectives can be different. An objective vector of objectives is understood as a vector of objectives that manifests itself in the operation of the system as an objective given, regardless of the declarations about the content and inorderliness of the vector of objectives, which can be announced by the governors of the system or written in instructions for setting it up and operating it. An example of how an objective vector of objectives manifests itself. A fresh example. This is the case of the Skripals. If we assume that one of these special services really did not like the ex-employee, who turned out to be a traitor, then there are many good, reliable methods of eliminating him, which do not leave traces by which the source of his death can be identified. And here, allegedly, Russia used a chemical warfare agent from which British medicine, not prepared for its use, easily cured 2 people, the victims themselves and another policeman who tried to give them first aid. And allegedly, well, Russia is so bad. That is, you see, from the point of view of effectiveness, the scenario attributed to Russia crosses all the lines. Even if we proceed from the fact that in the 1990s, thanks to the ancestral tribe cadre policy characteristic of the ancestral tribe system, the Russian special services also degraded, but not to that degree though. Therefore, if we pose the question of the objective vector of objectives that Britain follows, Then Britain accused Russia, factually, of three things: violation of a certain unspoken code of ethics for the interaction of special services and their employees with each other, and the conduct of sabotage and terrorist activities on its territory without a declaration of war. Well, that's the main thing that Britain has accused Russia of. What is it for? Well, let's take a look at history. Ivan the Terrible was killed by a British physician in ordinary. The conspiracy that resulted in the death of Paul I, curatorship from London. The Decembrist conspiracy is also not homegrown curatorship. The murder of Nikolai I during the Crimean War, interested parties, London and Paris. The assassination of Alexander III, co-participation during the First World War, in organizing an anti-government conspiracy in Russia. That is, history shows that gentlemen should not be trusted, because gentlemen can say whatever they want, blago-intentioned and blago-seeming speeches. But in reality they hide a very perfidious politics that is de facto carried out. And again, if we go back to the past, then in our opinion, when Vladimir Vladimirovich, instead of a farewell breakfast at the summit in Australia in 2014, got on a plane and flew to Russia, it was the right action that prevented the consequences of the farewell breakfast. To say that something has changed in Britain, no. As they followed these principles of politics, by announcement one thing, by default the other, over the past several centuries, they continue to follow them. This is one example, that an objective vector of objectives, it is an objective vector of objectives. It is really carried out in politics, in actions, in governance, regardless of how the objectives of governance by governors and owners of the system are declared. Potential vector of objectives. It contains those objective possibilities towards which the system of governance can work, but which are not used for various kinds of subjective reasons. In relation to the destiny of humanity, this is indeed a very voluminous concept that explains a lot. Global civilization is a complex set of regional civilizations interacting with each other. Well, we say, Russian world. What is the difference between the Russian world and the non-Russian world? After all, look, the technosphere that we use is identical to the technosphere of the Western countries. The computers through which we are now holding the lecture, the greater part of its software is American microsoftware. The architecture is different, but anyway, the principles in general are common. and the technosphere that
при
exists,
всем при том,
it was
что
formed on the basis
реально
of
у
science
нас
developed in the Western regional
постоянно
civilization in the last about
почти что
3 or 4
одинаковые в
centuries.
разных странах мира, если они принадлежат к одной климатической зоне. И много
But
другого
nevertheless,
общего.
despite the
Тем не
fact
менее,
that our
мы говорим
clothes
о том, что
have become
есть
almost the
русский
same
мир,
in
Китай
different
это
countries of the
Китай,
world,
Запад это Запад. В
if
чем
they belong to the
отличие?
same climatic zone, and there is
А
much more
отличие
in
как
common.
раз в том,
But
что каждая
nevertheless, we say
региональная
that the Russian world
цивилизация
is the Russian world,
характеризуется не
China
ее
is
текущим
China,
образом
the
жизни,
West is the West.
не
What
теми
is the difference?
достижениями культуры, которые есть, которыми она
The difference is
пользуется.
precisely that each
Она
regional
характеризуется
civilization
теми
is
идеалами,
characterized not by its current way of
цивилизация
life, not by the
встречает.
achievements of culture that it has,
А
which it
идеалы,
uses.
даже если они не реализованы,
It is characterized
они
by the ideals that
являются
civilization carries
частью
through the
Но с
centuries.
точки зрения теории управления, идеалы – это потенциальный вектор цели.
And ideals, even if they are not
Поскольку
realized,
потенциальный вектор
they determine the
цели,
essence of
он,
civilization.
в общем-то, не выражается ярко в практике.
But from the point of view of the theory of
Если бы он
governance,
ярко выражался,
ideals,
он бы был
this is a
объективным.
potential vector of
А
objectives.
он потенциальный, он присутствует, он может
And since the potential vector of
но
objectives,
в практике
it is not
текущего
expressed clearly in the
управления
practice
практически не
of current
выражается
governance.
или
If it were clearly
статистика
expressed in it, it would be an
событий,
objective vector of
связанных с ним,
objectives.
обусловленным
But
этим,
it is
она
potential.
не
It is
является
present. It can be realized.
статистикой. Она где-то там в хвостах распределения. То есть
But in the
не
practice of
измеряется
current
на
governance, it is practically not expressed.
И вот если так
Or
смотреть,
the statistics
то
of connected with it events,
Запад
conditioned by them.
реализовал свой
It is not the main
список
statistics.
целей,
It is somewhere there in the tales of distribution.
действительно
That is what is called
Запада
marginality.
передовых достигнут довольно
And if you look this way,
потребительского
then the West
благополучия,
has realized
включая
its potential vector of objectives.
включая бомжей и безработных. А вот если
And this is
говорить
expressed
о
in the
России,
fact that in the Western countries, at least in the
Россия
advanced
потенциальный
ones,
вектор цели
a quite high level of
реализовывает.
consumer well-being
И
has been
большинство
achieved,
населения
including the
России
consumer
живет,
well-being of homeless people and the unemployed.
мягко говоря, не по-русски, если соотноситься с
But if we talk
потенциальным
about
вектором
Russia,
цели
then Russia has not
русской
realized the
цивилизации.
potential vector of
Потому
objectives.
что идеал русской
And the
региональной
majority of the
цивилизации
population of
вызван на
Russia,
справедливость. Причем
they live, to put it
справедливость не
mildly,
какая-то
not Russianly,
выделенная
if we
человеком,
correlate
не
with the
одна
potential vector of
божественная
objectives
справедливость. А дальше
and the
тогда
Russian regional
получается такая
civilization.
вещь,
Because the ideals of the Russian regional civilization
историческое развитие
are previousness in life.
цивилизации – это продвижение к
Moreover,
воплощению.
it is not some kind of invented by man previousness, but extra-worldly, God's previousness.
К сожалению,
And further,
не
you
по
see, it turns out
пути, а по пути
that the historical
известий,
development
пути
of
ошибок,
civilization,
исканий, блужданий, пути
this is
отката в
progress
прошлое.
towards the incarnation
Поэтому
of this very extra-worldly
реальный образ
previousness
жизни
into
России,
life.
он может быть в разные эпохи очень далек от того идеала,
Unfortunately, progress is not along a straight path, but along a winding path,
Кроме того,
a path of errors, searches, wanderings, paths of rollback to the past.
Поэтому сам идеал этой самой неотмирной справедливости
Therefore, the real way of life in
в
Russia
понимается
can
тоже
be in
по-разному.
different eras
И в силу
very far
этого
from the ideal
обстоятельства
that it has been
говорят,
carrying
что,
throughout centuries,
во-первых,
exactly as the ideal.
исследование самого идеала и
Furthermore,
изменчивость того
the development of world
идеала,
understanding of
можно
people
назвать
is taking
исторической
place.
справедливостью,
Therefore,
как
the very ideal of this
воплощение
extra-worldly
идеала в
previousness,
жизнь, в общем-то,
in different
приводит к
eras,
тому,
it is understood
что
also
суть
differently.
России не понять,
And by strength of this twofold circumstance, firstly, the variability of the understanding of the ideal itself, and the variability of the phenomenon that can be called historical previousness, as an attempt to incarnate this ideal into life. In general, this leads to the fact that the essence of Russia cannot be understood. As F.I. Chuchev wrote, "Who would grasp Russia with the mind? For her no yardstick was created. Her soul is of a special kind, by faith alone appreciated." When he wrote this way, one must understand that he wrote from the standpoint of the world understanding formed by the education of a common European type. And the yardstick of which he speaks is the standard of world understanding, which is characteristic of the West. And Chuchev wrote quite correctly that with this standard of world understanding, Russia cannot be measured due to reasons that I have named. Striving for the ideal of extra-worldly previousness, which is understood in different ways, depending on the development of society, and the incarnation of this ideal into life, in the concretics of historical circumstances, depending on the extent to which it was incarnated. Therefore, Russia is always incomprehensible to foreign sages. But at the same time, it is not always understandable to those who live in Russia herself. Although Russia, the essence of Russia, is feelable for those who live in her. And this essence is so feelable that many foreigners, if they adhere to it, if they carry in themselves an aspiration towards this ideal, they are perceived by us as Russians, regardless of their ethnic origin, skin color, race, and so on. So, the potential vector of objectives is a very important concept for understanding the processes that take place in supersystems. There is also such a concept as an identified vector of objectives. You see, if an outside observer looks at the process of governance and does not have access to what is commonly called insider information, that is, to the information of those who organize this process of governance, control it, or directly carry it out, then he has a question about what objectives governance works towards in the observed system. This is an identificational task, that is, detection and evaluation. When I said that the objective vector of objectives of the West in the person of Britain and the British Empire, the British Commonwealth of Nations, does not correspond to the declared vector of objectives, this was precisely an example of identifying the vector of objectives. But you see, the task of identification does not always have an unambiguous solution. That is, you can get several variants, and after that, think which of these variants is more appropriate for life. They may have something common or something different. Nevertheless, this is the case. The second aspect consists in the fact that the identification of the vector of objectives of a certain system is carried out by the cognizing subject. And cognition is not absolute for a person. That is, there is always a certain erroneous component in cognition.
определенным уровнем в иерархии взаимной вложенности разных процентов.
And even if the identified vector of objectives is univocally identified, then the evaluations of all the included in it components may be somewhat erroneous. Therefore, the concept of identified vector of objectives is a purely subjective concept. Although it is a reflection of the objective one, and it's conditioned by a certain level in the hierarchy of mutual nestedness of different processes of governance. There is also an auto-identified subjective vector of objectives. It arises as a result of the fact that an individual himself tries to understand why he lives, what objectives he works towards, and where all this is heading. This is also the case with an auto-identified vector of objectives. The individual may be delusional in his self-evaluations, or he may be sufficiently competent in self-evaluations. Why is an auto-identified vector of objectives necessary? Well, it's needed in order to change one's own views on one's meaning of life, and if one is wrong in something from the point of view of the subject, then how to change one's own life so as to be right? This whole thing must be understood in order to correctly evaluate the processes taking place in supersystems. And intellect is part of the informational support for the behavior of its carrier, or an object of governance controlled by the carrier. Further, it turns out that if the informational support is organized in a hierarchical manner, then there arises the concept of an aggregate vector of objectives, which includes in itself all particular objectives connected with each level of the hierarchy. That is, the aggregate vector of objectives, like any vector of objectives, is hierarchically ordered. But it contains fragments that unite objectives into groups that are connected with some functions, and these functions in the general process of governance also form a certain hierarchy. In this case, it may turn out that the composition of the aggregate vector of objectives may contain different defects. We talked a little about defects when it came to the structure of the task of governance, about the vectors of objectives, the vector of state, and the vector of error. But, nevertheless, if we correlate with the entire function of governance, analyze the processes in supersystems, then the defectiveness of the vectors of objectives is a factor that it is simply alternatively necessary to take into account. Because many conflicts of governance in supersystems are conditioned precisely by the fact that there is a certain defectiveness of the vectors of objectives. One and the same particular objective can be repeated several times in different fragments of the aggregate vector of objectives at different hierarchical levels. You see, as long as governance is stable, and there are no problems with the implementation of all the objectives prescribed in the vector of objectives. This does not affect governance in any way. But if governance proceeds in such modes that the entire set of objectives cannot be achieved, then in this case, such things may arise that a group of objectives with a low priority is excluded from the vector of objectives for which the system works. That is, from the objective vector of objectives.
Конфликт приоритетов. Как его устранять? Либо признать.
But if at the same time, certain objectives that are in this excluded group are duplicated at higher levels of the hierarchy of the vector of objectives, then a conflict of governance is inevitable. Because having excluded a low priority group from the current process of governance, you thereby disrupt the implementation of higher priority groups of objectives. What to do in this case? Eliminate the conflicts of priorities. How? Well, either to recognize the objectives as irrelevant, and then either exclude these objectives from higher priority groups, or exclude all higher priority groups from the processes of governance. Or, if this is not possible, then the exclusion should be recognized as inappropriate, and you should work towards achieving these objectives too. Although some other objectives, if they are not connected by purely objective laws, with this objective in the group of excluded objectives, can really be excluded. But if they are connected by objective laws, then the exclusion becomes impossible, and you must provide governance that realizes all interconnected objectives at all relevant to you levels of hierarchies of the vector of objectives.
Они в этом случае отражают несовместимость.
This defect, described in the sufficiently general theory of governance, is called inversion of priorities. In addition, there can be antagonisms of single objectives, and there can be antagonisms of certain groups of objectives. Antagonisms mean the presence of mutually incompatible, mutually exclusive objectives at the same moment or time interval under the same priority. Antagonisms can be objective. They, in this case, reflect the incompatibility of the given vector of objectives with those objective laws on the basis of which the process of governance is built, or to which the process of governance is subordinated. And there are subjective antagonisms. Unlike objective antagonisms, subjective antagonisms do not require changes in the laws of nature. That is, if objective antagonisms are a very gross error in the setting of objectives, conditioned by inadequate perception of the objective laws, or by ignoring some objective laws, then subjective antagonisms, this is the result of some failures in the psyche of the personality in building a model of the process of governance.
Каждый свои вектора целей. И
That is, something was not taken into account from that which a person knows or should have known. If the elements combine themselves into a supersystem, or several supersystems combine themselves into a supersystem that encompasses them, then they all carry their own vectors of objectives. And accordingly, the process of governance, both in supersystems consisting of a plurality of elements and in the encompassing supersystems that absorb a certain number of taken-shape supersystems, singled out according to these or those features. In fact, all this can be stable, on condition that the vectors of objectives are compatible. And if, again, we correlate with the problems of global politics, then there is a potential vector of objectives of Russian civilization. There is an objective vector of objectives of Russian civilization. There is an objective vector of objectives of Western civilization. And there is a declared vector of objectives of Western civilization. Well, by strength of the fact that the potential vector of objectives of Russian civilization does not coincide with the objective vector of objectives of Western civilization, the integration into a certain unified system, in principle, is not possible under the current circumstances, under the current state of each of the supersystems. What prospects does this open up? Well, if you look at the history of the last few decades, even centuries, well, at least since the time of Peter I, Russia has tried to be a part of the West. That is, in its objective vector of objectives, in fits and starts, those objectives were expressed that the domestic elite, the domestic intelligentsia, perceived from the Western system of education. But since, along with this, attempts have always made their way to realize the potential vector of objectives, Russia has been living for a long time in an internal conflict of governance. And this conflict of internal governance is, in fact, supported by the West, since the West implements the conception of globalization on the basis of the Bible. And with the implementation of this conception, all other regional civilizations must either disappear or become identical to the West. Well, I said that the West realized its vector of objectives, in the sense food for everyone, pleasure for everyone during life, and so on and so forth. But it realized it by violating a number of the objective laws to which the life of human societies and people personally are subordinated. Therefore, the realization of the achievement of objectives, well, not global objectives, but within its own borders by the West, further it entails that the objective laws to which the lives of people are subordinate, they will discharge themselves in the West. And this will be expressed in the form of biological and social cultural degradation of the population, and not only the common people, but also the establishment, that is, the political elite of Western states. So, what we are faced with now, when the intellectual abilities of representatives of the political elite of different Western states are questionable, even among the representatives of our elite, and not only among sane people, well, such a state of affairs will continue to exist and will most likely become aggravated, because those who graduate from Western universities now, when they come into big politics, against their background, Theresa May, Boris Johnson will look like holy intellectuals. Therefore, we don't need to delude ourselves. The West will degrade. As for Russia, you see, the more intensively we are trying to be like the West, pronouncing the thesis, Russia is a European country, the more intensively degradational processes, both biological and socio-cultural ones, will proceed in our country. In such a variant, in the worst, in the harshest variant, a situation may arise when China becomes the savior of Russian culture. Therefore, it's better not to bring it to this, not to try to be a part of the West, but we have to purpose-orientedly move to the politics of realizing our own civilizational ideals, the ideals of comprehending and incarnating into life that eternal God's previousness, the loyalty towards which Russia carries throughout the centuries. If this is not the case, then the internal conflict of the vector of objectives of governance, one way or the other, will affect politics and will reduce both the quality of governance and the quality of life, and hinder the solution of many tasks. In particular, our coat of arms, a two-headed eagle plus a third invisible head under the crown. This, whether we like it or not, is a symbol of conceptually non-determined, internally conflicted governance. When two heads, each of which carries its own conception of governance, look in different directions, they would gladly run aside. But the crown hovers over them, which hides a certain invisible third head, which governs this very conflict. There where there is no conceptually non-determined, internally conflicted governance, there is a different heraldry. There is one head on the shoulders, even though there are heraldic animals in something, and they raise doubts about their life consistency and the meaningfulness of their actions. Any two vectors of objectives can be correlated with each other in order to detect the identity of the included in them particular objectives and the order of following their priorities. Now, if you correlate two vectors in such a way that you can see that your first, second, third, and some other objectives coincide, and n plus 1, the first objective, in one vector of objectives is 1, and in the other vector of objectives, n plus 1, the first objective, is already another objective. While governance proceeds in such a way that only the first n objectives are relevant, then in this there are no conflicts of governance, nor can there be any. As soon as this n+1 objective falls into the objective vector of objectives of governance, there begins the discord of the integral process of governance. If, for some reason, this n+1 objective in one or both vectors of objectives begins to increase its hierarchical significance, that is, to climb up the list of priorities, then the conflict is exacerbated. This is the concept of the depth of identity of the vector of objectives. And in fact, for internally conflictless governance, the greater the depth of identity of the vectors of objectives of different subjects, the easier it is to organize their interaction and the fewer problems there are in their interaction in the process of supersystemic governance. Well, again, let's look at historical examples. It took shape in such a way that the Second World War of the 20th century went somewhat differently from the scenarios that were originally tailored for it. As a result, it turned out that the Soviet Union, Britain, and the USA were allies in the anti-Hitler coalition. The objective, to defeat the Third Reich, was the first priority for all participants. It was defeated. What further? And further it turned out that this objective ceased to be relevant, and mutually exclusive objectives became relevant. As a result of which, what was called the Cold War arose. As a result of the same thing, the United Nations organization, over the course of more than 70 years, has been demonstrating its functional incapability. Moreover, a strikingly expressed functional incapability. Why? Because the main secret of the history of the 20th century, the history of the Second World War of the 20th century, is the question of what happened at the Tehran Conference when J.V. Stalin and F.D. Roosevelt for several days stayed in the Soviet embassy in Tehran and, to all appearances, did not sit around, each in his corner. They talked about something, talked not under protocol, and as a result of these conversations, there emerged the conception of the United Nations as an instrument designed for the solution of global problems in the conditions of post-war cooperation and mutual support of two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. These objectives were prescribed in the United Nations Charter, and the entire UN organizational system was oriented on the solution of these tasks. And even the veto right, which was given to the member states of the UN Security Council, this is not a sui generis stopcock that prohibits the implementation of a decision on behalf of the UN if one of the member states of the Security Council does not agree with this decision. Those tasks that were set before the UN on the basis of the Tehran agreements by F.D. Roosevelt and J.V. Stalin, they presupposed that, indeed, members of the UN Security Council in some situations may have different opinions on one and the same question. And if again to correlate with the sufficiently general theory of governance, with the practice of implementing the entire function of governance, this suggests that with the sincere blago-intentionedness of all members of the Security Council, I emphasize, with sincere blago-intentionedness, the divergence of opinions is not a consequence of the mutual incompatibility of their objective vectors of objectives. Divergence of opinions is the result of these or those subjective errors, conditioned by culture, historical past, under the impact of which this divergence of opinions arises.
Под воздействием которых, и возникает это расхождение во мнениях.
Accordingly, the veto right was originally functionally oriented not towards sticking a spoke in the wheels of the UN as an international organization. It was oriented towards blocking the implementation in life of underripe decisions that, with their realization, could cause certain negative consequences for all of humanity. Well, if there is no conflict of interests, that is, the depth of identity of the vectors of objectives of the participating countries is sufficient for the functioning of the UN, then this means that in case of divergence in opinions, it is possible to build a certain advisory group of experts who possess information connected with this problem, who can detect errors in both approaches that are mutually incompatible for the solution of the problem, and, accordingly, having detected errors, they can generate a certain third opinion, which is acceptable to all members of the UN Security Council, and which is not a compromise. That is, you see, this does not require someone to make concessions to others by strength of the fact that his resources, his power, do not allow dictating this decision from a position of strength. Well, since it really happened that after the murders of F.D. Roosevelt and J.V. Stalin, these tasks ceased to be relevant for the United States, after Comrade W. Churchill arrived and explained to them in Fulton what and how to do it right, they ceased to be relevant for the Soviet Union when the curators of N.S. Khrushchev began a coup d'etat in 1953, which ended with the proclamation of the 1993 Constitution 40 years later. Then the UN, by strength of the conflicts of incompatibility of the vectors of objectives of Western regional civilization, Russian regional civilization, China as also a peculiar civilization. The UN is functionally incapable, and the prospects for its functional capability are not foreseen, as long as the West is characterized by a certain hypocrisy expressed in the divergence between the declarations and the factually pursued politics.
и фактически проводимой политики. Вот.
The problematics of a purely noospheric character is also connected with how the aggregate vector of objectives is formed. When elements combine themselves into a supersystem, and several supersystems combine themselves into an encompassing supersystem. That is, how collective intellect takes shape.
Понимаете, вот вектор целей любой, он в силу того, что
You see, any vector of objectives, by strength of the fact that the governors are subjects, is of a subjective character. And nraviousness, real nraviousness, that is, nravious standards with evaluations of good, bad, absolute evaluations or situationally conditioned evaluations, they play the role of a conditional jump operator in the activities of the psyche of both people and collectives. That is, if the condition is met, then one sequence of actions is carried out further on. If the conditions are not met, another sequence of actions is implemented. And all that concerns the intentional or involuntary formation of collective intellects, it is also tied to the problematics of the formation of vectors of objectives of those subjects who participate in these collective intellects. That is, if the depth of identity of their vectors of objectives is small, then the collective intellect is almost impossible to form, or to be precise, it will form by itself, but it will be schizophrenic. And this collective schizophrenia is really a real problem for the entire global civilization of our days. Because everyone chats about the need to resolve the global environmental crisis. And, at the same time, the actions of the overwhelming majority are aimed at making it worse. Everyone chats about human rights, their protection on a global scale, but human rights are understood in a mutually exclusive way. And under the slogans of protecting human rights, anti-human politics is actually being carried out, preventing the formation of the civilization of humanness on Earth. Therefore, the question of the defectiveness of the vectors of objectives of different subjects, about their non-coincidence, about the low depth of identity of vectors of objectives, about the work aimed at eliminating the defectiveness of the vectors of objectives of different subjects, different associations of subjects. This is indeed a very relevant task. The entrance into this task is through understanding the sufficiently general theory of governance. But the keys to the solution of this task, they are in the field of psychological science. Moreover, psychological science not of the Freudian type, and not of the type Vedic traditions, but a psychological science which would be based on the informational algorithmic theory of the psyche of the individual and the collective psyche of aggregations of personalities, of culturally sui generis societies, and humanity as a whole. In general, everything that we see in the life of a civilized or not very civilized society, this is all an expression of the psychic activity of people. Psychic activity in many generations. Therefore, the keys to detecting and resolving all these problems should be given by psychological science as a functionally specialized branch of the sufficiently general theory of governance. What else is there? You see, human informational algorithmic support is two-leveled. There is an innate component. It includes in itself unconditioned reflexes and instincts. If there is a biological norm of health, then this innate component is in fact the same for everyone, but taking into account the difference in sex. That is, boys have their own characteristic features, girls have their own characteristic features, but in the life of the biological species Homo sapiens, these features mutually supplement each other and ensure the process of stable life of the population of the species Homo sapiens, but on condition that the culture is at a zero or close to zero level.
Дальше начинается развитие культуры и возникает то, что
Further, there begins the development of culture.
информационно-алгоритмического обеспечения.
And there arises something that is not an innate component of informational algorithmic support. And here the question arises about the fact that culture, as an informational algorithmic system, is variative.
И гармонию взаимоотношений цивилизации и природы.
We can build a culture that will ensure both intrasocial harmony and harmony in the interrelationships between civilizations and nature.
Его остатки будут
Or we can build a culture that will kill the society that carries it in the course of the life of several generations, after which its remnants will be ethnographic raw materials.
новых социальных систем на
There is such a turn of speech, a concept invented by the liberals, for the building of new social systems on the basis of different principles.
хоть западный, когда коренное
One of the examples of this kind in history is the collapse of the Roman Empire, both the Eastern and Western ones, when the indigenous population lost its defective culture and became ethnographic raw materials for building new social systems carrying a new culture.
И вот если такого рода вещи
And if this kind of
это
thing
означает,
happens,
что
it means that culture,
культура,
as an informational algorithmic system,
алгоритмическая система вошла в
has come into
противоречие
conflict with the innate component
с
of
врожденным
informational algorithmic support of human life,
информационно-алгоритмического
that is, with the biological basis,
человека, то
as well as with the other objective laws to which the life of human society is subordinated,
объективными закономерностями, которым подчинена жизнь человеческого общества. И это
and this
действительно
really poses a great
представляет
danger.
опасность. И вот одна
And
из
one of the
проблем
problems of Russia
тоже
is also that in the current culture,
что в ныне
many
сложившейся
components contradict and are not compatible with the biological basis, that is, with the genetic program for the development of the human organism and psyche, and with the objective laws to which the life of human society is subordinated.
С объективными закономерностями, которым подчинена жизнь человеческого общества. Ну, в частности,
In particular, modern pedagogical culture, subculture, way of life, primarily in cities, in megalopolises, they are built in such a way that they suppress and distort the possibilities of the full-fledged realization of the genetic program, of the becoming, first of all, of boys as men. In some part, this concerns the suppression and distortion of the genetic programs for the development of girls as women. As for boys, you see, boys are genetically programmed to play with danger. Hence the teenage subcultures of roofers, train surfing. From the standpoint of adult jurisprudence, all this is considered as a crime. If not of the criminal code, then a crime against the civil code. Violation of law and order. Violation of a comfortable lifestyle for adults. But in reality, biology, the genetic program for the development of the organism, requires that at a certain age, boys play with danger. Therefore, if adults don't like the culture of train surfers, roofers, bikers, and, then this means that the way of life of civilization should open up possibilities for the realization of the genetic program in ways safe for both others around and for children themselves, who grow up and simply work out the genetic program of development without being conscious of it. But if the way of life suppresses and distorts the genetic programs for the development of the psyche and organisms of children, then such a way of life is in the long term dangerous for that culturally peculiar society that carries it and does not find in itself either reasoning or political will in order to build a different way of life.
Но вот все такого рода вещи, они
But all this kind of thing, it is difficult to understand in the absence of governorial literacy on the basis of the theory of governance, which allows interpreting any processes in nature, in society, in technology, as processes of governance or self-governance. But if the sufficiently general theory of governance, universal in the sense of the ability to describe any processes as governance or self-governance, is mastered, then a lot in life becomes clear, understandable, and obliging the global civilization to change its way of life. Well, in general, that's all for today. Spring has come. Now we have lecture 11. A lot of time has passed since the first lecture. But if you read the materials on your own, namely the preliminary materials of the training course of the sufficiently general theory of governance, then actually it would be possible to master everything much faster than at the pace of recording lectures on the sufficiently general theory of governance on the channel Noosphere. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you all success in further creative activities for the blogger of the whole Earth.